Hi everyone, my name is Emily Heinlein and I am getting ready to do our counseling theories presentation over feminist theory. And throughout my presentation, I do include some page numbers throughout it. So just in case you're following along, feminist theory is chapter 12 in our book and the first page starts on 337. But let's go ahead and jump right into it. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and jump right into the foundations and the history regarding feminist therapy and feminist counseling. So actually kind of unsimilarly to the other perspectives and therapies we've been talking about, feminist therapy does not have a single person or single founder that can be identified as starting the feminist approach. However, the book does talk about how it was kind of a collaboration effort. And I would argue that it kind of just started with some ideas and then a bunch of people kind of expanded on those ideas, added some things to those ideas, research all of these things to kind of make feminist approach what it is today. I do want to mention that because of this, and since there is no single founder and things like that, it is kind of hard to pinpoint exactly where feminist therapy came about. But the book does talk a lot about American history. So for my next slide, whenever I discuss the timeline and what was coming about for feminist theory and what was going on, I do base a lot of these events off of American history. So just go ahead and keep that in mind before we continue. So here is the timeline of events that I created in regards to feminist theory and all the things and all the events that were kind of going on to help feminist therapy emerge. So first we have the first wave feminism that occurred in the late 1800s. So essentially this wave of feminism heavily focused on more political and legal contexts. So a large portion of the goals during this wave of feminism was giving women the right to vote. And that was a huge, huge portion of this time period. And on that note, we have August 18th, 1920. If you didn't know, that was when the 19th Amendment was ratified. And this is a time where women were finally given the right to vote. So, and then we move on into the 1960s, and this is when second wave feminism began, and it kind of went a little bit into the 1990s. But before I get ahead of myself, second wave feminism is really the huge developmental period for feminist theory. And the book says it's kind of the emergence of feminist theory. But during this wave, it was really focused on just giving women a seat at the table. So a huge focus was just mainly giving women a voice in a male-dominated world. So it focused on a lot of different topics, but some really important ones were just reproductive rights, sexual rights, and a lot of just different social rights and women working and things like that. Next we have the 1980s, and the book tells us that this is when feminist group therapy came about, and that is going to be on page 341. So essentially this is a type of group therapy that came in feminist theory that kind of focused more on issues that impact women the most. So it were things like sexual abuse, domestic and dating violence, as well as just body image issues and eating disorders, etc., etc. So a lot of people argue about whether third wave and fourth wave feminism exists, but just for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to go ahead and just talk about what these are. So third wave feminism kind of comes right after second wave feminism and starts from the 1990s and goes until the early 2000s. And third wave feminism is when the topic of intersectionality came about, which I'll talk a little bit about later. But mainly this wave of feminism just wanted to put its aim towards addressing the failures of what the second wave feminism didn't address. And then finally, we have fourth wave feminism, which came about in 2013, and people could argue that it's still kind of happening now. But this is when the huge emphasis on intersectionality came about, as well as things like inclusivity, but those words can kind of go hand in hand. As well as it had a huge emphasis on social media movement. So as technology has been progressing, it's been kind of being used as a tool for social media and the internet and things like that to advocate and emphasize feminism and the feminist movement. So an example of this is just the Me Too movement, the hashtag Me Too movement, when women all over the world were sharing their stories all over social media. So that's just an example. But I do just want to say that things are always happening. The thing that I like about feminist theory and is kind of unique is that it's pretty trendy and it likes to stay up to date with things. So all kinds of occurrences are happening every day that could heavily influence feminist theory for the future. Okay, so as mentioned before, feminist therapy doesn't necessarily have a founder and can be kind of known as a collaboration effort between many people. So the book does discuss 4 women that made huge strides for feminist therapy, so I'm going to go ahead and highlight each of them. So first we have Jean Baker Miller, and she was really awesome. She was a professor of psychiatry, and she had a huge focus on diversity regarding feminist theory. And she loved to collaborate with other professors and other colleagues about this topic. She was also heavily a part of the development regarding relational cultural theory, which I'll talk a little bit about later in the presentation. But a lot of her focus on issues regarding feminist theory were all about social action and social change, as well as workplace change. So next we have Dr. Carolyn Zerby Enns, and I hope that's how you pronounce her name. But she received her doctorate in counseling psychology and had a huge emphasis on feminist therapy and the therapeutic practices for women. She had a huge focus on the multicultural feminist therapy and the influence that that had around the world. So she actually did a lot of her studies and research focused around Japan and that culture. So pretty cool stuff there. Next, we have Dr. Oliva M. Espin. And she also has her doctorate in counseling theories, but she actually specialized in Latin American studies. So pretty similar to Dr. Enns, she did a lot of her studies regarding multicultural issues. She had a particular interest in immigrants and therapy and counseling practices for that population. But she actually did a lot of research on Latin America women and psychotherapy. Last but not least, we have Dr. Laura S. Brown, and I have to say I'm a little biased because I think she's so cool. However, she is one of the founders of the Feminist Therapy Institute, and a lot of her work is just on feminist therapy and feminist theory and feminist counseling. So she actually has a book titled Just Feminist Therapy. So if you're interested in that, I could probably hook you up. But she is a professor of forensic psychology, and a lot of her research regarding feminist therapy is mainly on trauma response and victims and survivors of trauma and how feminist therapy has influenced them. So, what need did feminist therapy fill? Why is feminist therapy so important? First, I'm going to say that feminist therapy was the first theory that was completely or somewhat completely developed by women. If you haven't noticed so far in our class, every theory that we've talked about was created or founded by somebody of the same demographic. And when I say that somebody, it's all typically old white men. So feminist therapy is a little different in that it's the first theory that we've talked about that is kind of more of an effort of multiple people over a long period of time, with many different collaborators, and those collaborators are mostly going to be women with different voices and different diversity concerns and different ideas and perspectives. So to me, that's what makes feminist therapy so unique. We also see that feminist counseling puts intersections of gender and other social identities, social location, and power at the core of the therapeutic process. I think the book puts it really great, and this is located on page 339 in this statement, because it's the first theory that talks about gender as well as social identities and how that influences our mental health. So on that, there's a huge focus on social justice and the influence of these contextual and situational environmental factors on how we view the world and our struggles and our mental health. So it focuses on empowering clients and how to recognize these social identities and social justice issues and diversity concerns and what that looks like and how it is impacting us. And finally, it does have a huge emphasis on having multiple identities and the impact of having these multiple identities have on our struggles. So just for sake of example, if you are a woman and you also identify as having a disability, so those are two different identities. You could live in a situation where having a disability is causing you more suffering than being a woman. So the social identity of identifying with having a disability in that community can impact you more and cause you more hurt and cause you more suffering than your gender does. So if you live in a situation where you don't have a lot of financial stability, and if we're going to use the example of the disability being some sort of chronic illness where you need lots of medication and the lack of financial stability and the resources and the support around you could cause a lot of hurt, not having access to those medications. So in that situation, you're more worried about getting your next dose of medicine and how you're going to take care of yourself than you are about your social status of identifying as a woman. So with that, it just shows how feminist therapy does focus on those many different diversity concerns and how gender is a huge influential portion of feminist therapy, but it's not the sole focus of feminist therapy. It's all about diversity concerns and those intersections. On that note, what did feminist therapy already expand on? So first, honestly, I really do think Alfred Adler was a feminist, considered especially in the time period that he was in. So in regards to Adlerian theory, Adlerian theory did have a focus on social equality as well as social interests, and that is something that Alfred Adler did discuss. So I feel like feminist therapy just went more in depth onto those topics. Also, feminist theory recognized the limitations of previous theories and their inherent bias that they had on women specifically. So I'll get into a little bit later, but things like assessment and other theories have shown that there are kind of bias, and they show that bias or favoritism or whatever towards different identities or gender especially. Next, feminist therapy did heavily expand or lay foundation for different cultural theories. Multiculturalism will come up a lot throughout feminist therapy, so it's just important to know that this did expand a lot of ideas and concepts. Feminist therapy also helped therapy practice understand how identifying with marginalized groups or those social identities can cause hurt. A lot of theories did not recognize that, or they began to recognize it, but they didn't really go into depth. And then finally, and what I would argue is most importantly, it expanded on previous theories to shift the focus to gender-sensitive practices and awareness on how oppression, societal, environmental influences, and cultural context can affect clients. So, we've all been kind of discussing these theories and looking at the foundations they've laid and things like that. But feminist theory kind of goes into more in depth and shows how oppression, our environments, and the context that we live in, and the cards that we're dealt can heavily affect our well-being and our happiness. Okay, so moving on to the principles of feminist therapy, you can actually find these listed on pages 343 through 345. So I'm just going to run through these really fast. But the first principle is the personal is political and critically conscious. So essentially this is when clients are kind of aware and they acknowledge their place in society. And so the best way the book puts it is on page 343, where it says, acknowledgement of the political and societal impact on an individual's life is perhaps the most fundamental tenet that lies at the core of feminist therapy. So that's incredibly important. So that's the first principle. The second is going to be commitment to social change. And this is something to me that is really unique about feminist therapy. And essentially this is talking about how feminist therapy uses a societal change or like social activism to help empower clients. So a lot of times therapy focuses on change within the individual, but this therapy also focuses on change in society and actual societal change and movements and things like that. The third is going to be women's rights, voices, marginalization, and oppression are valued, and their experience is honored. So a huge part of feminist therapy is just giving the client a voice. And so using the topic of women in therapy, all the past theories did kind of have a patriarchal way of operating, kind of on an androcentric way of being created. So feminist therapy kind of searches to smush that a little bit. So it's shifting women's experiences and empowering them again. Empowerment is a huge thing in feminist therapy, to encourage people to use their voice and to use their experience for good. The fourth is going to be the counseling relationship is egalitarian. And essentially this is just how there is a power imbalance and a power differential in a counseling relationship. So in this situation, the counselor seeks to recognize that power imbalance and shift the power and privilege to the client as much as possible. The fifth is going to be a focus on strengths and a reformulation of psychological distress. So essentially this is avoiding kind of those labels and how stress and symptoms are kind of reframed as a way of survival. So the book kind of gives a definition or an example of somebody that survived sexual violence in childhood might struggle with disassociation in adulthood, and that could just be a coping mechanism that they used. Finally, the sixth principle is all types of oppression are recognized along with their connections. So essentially the book just stresses that it's not just about gender, it can be any kind of socio-cultural aspect of your life. So it can consider like disability, race, ethnicity, things like that. And again, it's just all about empowerment and recognizing the connections between our experiences to how we live our life and our mental health and things like that. All right, so now I'm going to go over some of the keywords and definitions that are important for feminist therapy. First, we have the egalitarian relationship. I did touch on this a little bit, but again, it's just how there is a power imbalance in the counseling relationship. Counselors do have a level of power over their clients, and being a client can be a very vulnerable spot. And so basically with the egalitarian relationship, we recognize that and we strive towards creating that balance back and giving clients as much power and privilege as we can in that relationship. Next, we have relational cultural theory, or RCT. The book touches on this a little bit, but from what I've understood, RCT is basically how relationships and belonging is kind of how you get meaning and feel empowerment. And so the book uses the idea that women are heavily influenced by connectedness and relationships as part of their identity, which kind of segues into feminist therapy. Next, we have gender fair approaches, and this is essentially recognizing that the differences between genders is most likely due to socialization factors rather than innate natures. There's not really much more to say on that. It's just that a lot of the views and theories that we've had so far are kind of androcentric. So feminist therapy seeks to have that more gender fair approach. Now we have flexible multicultural perspective, and essentially this is using concepts that apply to everyone regardless of groups. And this is on page 341, by the way, but the groups, for example, could be age, race, culture, gender, ability, class, or sexual orientation. Next, we have the interactionist view, and this is where concepts use dimensions of human experience as well as environmental and contextual factors. So interactionist, feminism is heavily important, especially with the fourth wave feminism, but it's essentially not isolating, being a feminist for only like white middle class women. It's focusing on all races, all ethnicities, sexual orientations, class, age groups, all of that. And then finally, we have the lifespan perspective, which we have talked a little bit about, I believe, in some of the other theories. But it's the idea that human development is a lifelong process. So kind of how psychodynamic really heavily focuses on our childhood experiences, feminist therapy is more focused on our experiences as we go through life, and that development and changes happen throughout our entire lives, and it's not completely fixed to just childhood. All right, so in regards to some of the important concepts for feminist therapy, the goals, for my first point, the goals of feminist therapy are pretty narrow in my opinion, but the book talks about something that N says, which was a feminist therapist I spoke about earlier. But she said the goals of feminist therapy include empowerment, valuing and affirming diversity, striving for change rather than adjustment, equality, balancing independence and interdependence, social change, and self-nurturance, or otherwise self-care and taking care of yourself. So feminist therapy, in my opinion, is very unique in this aspect, in that it does kind of not so much focus on illness. It kind of really heavily focuses on cultural factors, a lot of these words are pretty hard to say, and like our diverse experiences and how that affects us. So if you're not wondering already, you're probably questioning the role of men and how that works in feminist therapy. And a lot of times people have the attitude, because feminist therapy and feminist counseling is focused a lot on women's issues, that because it's pro-women, it means it's anti-man, but that's not the case at all, and studies do show that men can benefit from feminist therapy, but men can be feminist therapists, and men can also receive feminist counseling, and it has been shown to be beneficial as well. Another concept is going to be the diversity perspective, and this is heavily influential in feminist therapy. I keep talking about all these socio-cultural factors and how they do influence feminist therapy and how we treat clients. But using diversity and people's diverse experiences, sometimes we don't realize how much a person's culture and societal factors, the way they were raised, socioeconomic status, ability, all these things can really affect the way we think and our opinions and how we live life and how we experience oppression or empowerment and things like that. So feminist therapy does strive to celebrate diversity and look at diversity through a new perspective to essentially help clients as much as we can, understanding their stories, their voices, and their experiences as much as we can. So in regards to feminist counseling, we need to kind of look at what causes the concern and what helps concerns. So from what I've understand after reading the chapter, a lot of what causes hurt within clients is going to be those cultural concerns, as well as socioeconomic concerns. So a lot of the way we were raised, the environments that we're in, how our family operates, and all of those factors. We also need to look at oppression and marginalization. I've talked a little bit about social groups and stuff earlier in the presentation, but having part of your identity associated with a specific population can heavily affect us, and sometimes that can cause hurt and suffering. We also have socialization. So a lot of times stereotypes and different ideas and the way we are socialized can hurt people. So that's one thing to note as well. As for what promotes change from that hurting, there are a few different things, but becoming aware of your marginalized status or the gender role can help. So a lot of times when people reclaim their identity or take back, things that were once hurtful, but they understand and acknowledge that marginalized status, and they kind of use it to their benefit and reclaim that to empower them. Next, we have acquiring skills and confidence to change the situation. So a lot of times feminist therapists will be talking to their clients, and essentially they just train them or give them the skills or confidence to be able to create that individual change as well as that like social action. Next, we have developing a sense of personal and societal power. This is a big one too. Kind of touching on what I just said. Developing, the confidence and getting those skills to change something inside the individual will more than likely help change society as well. So a lot of times, and I'll get into this in a second, that feminist therapists will encourage their clients to join an organization or a social group or some kind of social activism organization to help them gain power. And finally, trusting experiences and your intuition. So it's kind of just like blindly trusting yourself, loving yourself, despite all of the things that have affected you and made you who the person you are today. Okay, so now we're finally to the fun part of the presentation, in my opinion. So now I'm going to be talking a little bit about the therapeutic process and basically what that looks like in feminist therapy. So essentially, these are going to be the techniques that feminist therapists use to aid in the counseling process for clients. But first, we have empowerment, and this is going to be encouraging clients to be confident, reach their goals, and achieve wellness. So essentially, empowerment is just kind of a fancy word for giving the client power to make their own change. Next, we have self-disclosure, and essentially this is using like modeling and counselor experiences to normalize clients' feelings to an extent. We kind of talked about this, I think, in ethics a little bit so far, but sometimes it's okay for counselors to self-disclose about their own experiences, and this is especially useful in feminist therapy, as it can aid in helping a client recognize that they're not alone and that somebody else can relate to their experiences. Next, we have gender role or social identity analysis, and this is basically how clients identify gender role affects their values and who they are. So this is in feminist therapy. It's kind of how feminist therapy will help, or therapists will help clients recognize either their gender role or social identity can be at the root of their problem. So essentially, the book uses a great example of body image and how women are typically socialized to grow up. I mean, we see it in magazines, in commercials, kind of everywhere we look, to be a certain size and to be fit and to be skinny and healthy and all of these things. However, men most of the time don't really have that societal pressure to fit that box or check that box or fit into that mold that was given for women whenever it comes to body image. So a feminist counselor might help a client reach that point where they recognize that a part of what's causing them that suffering related to their body image might be associated with their gender role in society. Next, we have gender role intervention. So essentially, this is placing gender role expectations in the context of today's world. So back on that same example that I was using of body image, in this situation, a client could disclose that they're having a really difficult time with their body image and that they're feeling like they have to meet this certain expectation. And that is when the counselor might say something along the lines that society does have this huge pressure on women to be basically models, and sometimes this image is mostly unattainable to the average person, and how it can be a very hard thing to cope with whenever everything that we see on TV and magazines and on social media is trying to get us to fit this certain role. So that's kind of an intervention that might be used. Next, we have power analysis, and this is going to be assessing access to power and how this affects our mental well-being. So essentially, the book puts it as how clients understand unequal access to power and resources can influence our own personal realities. So in our relationships, there's typically some kind of power differential. Whether that be, society sees men as having more power than women. It could be within the workplace, in relationships and partnerships, and things like that as well. So bibliotherapy is very interesting, but essentially this is using like other materials and educational resources to assist clients. So something that I found that was really interesting is that in feminist therapy, a counselor could recommend like a self-help book to a client that relates to maybe the concern that they're addressing in that therapy session that week. And I find this really interesting because, as a counselor, we only have so much expertise, and sometimes it's very helpful for clients to hear another perspective. So I think bibliotherapy is pretty cool in that aspect. Next, we have assertiveness training, and this is essentially teaching new behavior, typically assertiveness, to aid in communication. So just for sake of example, a lot of times women growing up are socialized to be more passive and to be people pleasers and things like that. But with assertiveness training, counselors can encourage and promote assertive behavior. And this is mostly in women, I would say. But if a client is disclosing that they're having a difficult time having the confidence to give an idea at work or bring a voice to the table or something like that. A counselor can do this assertiveness training to teach the client how to be more assertive at work and how to use that communication and be confident with that communication and kind of help with that passiveness that we have been grown up and socialized to do. Reframing and relabeling is something that's kind of specialized to feminist therapy, but it's reevaluating the cause of distress and labels and making them to be a little bit more positive in connotation. So if a client comes in calling themselves really hurtful names, for example, the counselor might help reframe that idea to be something a little more positive. So if a woman comes into a therapy session and calls themselves too quiet or not good enough or something like that, the counselor may encourage them to start calling themselves strong and powerful and can facilitate change and all these other positive labels. So group work is going to be transitioning from individual therapy to joining group therapy or support groups. I did talk a little bit about where feminist therapy first came out with group sessions, but a lot of times, a lot of the issues that affect clients that are benefiting from feminist therapy can be very beneficial to be in that group setting where they can share experiences and share voices with other people dealing with the same thing. And then now we have social action. I did touch upon this a little bit, but this is using activities related to social justice to aid in therapy. So a lot of times, like we talked about, empowerment is of the core of feminist therapy. We always want to empower our clients using feminist therapy. And so using things like volunteering or joining organizations or social active groups could be very important and help aid in a client's wellness. Surprise! I have a pop quiz, and I'm just kidding. But I know I'm kind of going over time, but I think these questions could be very beneficial if you still haven't fully grasped feminist therapy. Okay, so here are some of the questions that I came up with. So let's just go ahead and start with number 1. Which of these answers are an example of bibliotherapy? And the correct answer is going to be A, which can be found on page 351. But answer A says, a counselor recommending a client a self-help book over gender oppression to read before their next session. So again, that's kind of using the outside homework, another perspective for the counselor to use for that bibliotherapy. Next, we have number 2, men cannot be feminist therapists and feminist therapy cannot be practiced with male clients. And that is going to be false, and that is going to be found on page 353. Like I said, men do have a very big role in feminist therapy and aiding in social change and things like that. So studies do show that men can benefit from this as well. Number 3, true or false, there is no single founder of feminist therapy. In fact, feminist therapy is seen more of a collaboration effort between many individuals. And that is going to be true, and that is found on page 340. Again, I think feminist therapy is mainly just about social change and social activism and social justice, with a little bit of gender roles and all kinds of other perspectives and, ideas from other theories. If like all of that made a baby, I think it would be feminist therapy. Number 4, what is an egalitarian relationship? And the correct answer is going to be B, found on page 354, and that says the act of balancing the power in a counseling relationship between counselor and client. So it's avoiding that power differential as much as possible within that counseling relationship, giving that power to the client as much as possible. And finally, some of the goals of feminist therapy include D, all of these answers are actually right, and you can find that on page 345. So things like social change, affirming diversity, and empowerment are all really important goals for feminist therapy, but you can find a giant list on page 345. All right, so I'm a 4 on the Enneagram, and I know this might be a little bit pointless to some of you all, but I personally really identify with quotes and art and expression and things like that, so I just had to throw in some different sayings and quotes. So I'm going to start from left to right, starting with the top and then move to the bottom. But first, we have privilege is when you think something's not a problem because it's not a problem to you personally. Very important, very true. The second one is we all should know that diversity makes for a rich tapestry, and we must understand that all the threads of the tapestry are equal in value no matter what their color. A very obvious, famous quote there. The next quote I included is, I raise my voice not so that I can shout, but so that those without a voice can be heard. Again, another quote from a very famous person and social activist. Moving down to the bottom left, I really love poetry. It's something I've always been really interested in. So this is something that was circulating a while ago that I really like, but it says, scream so that one day, 100 years from now, another sister will not have to dry her tears, wondering where in history she lost her voice. Again, I just find that very moving, and I do also find it very applicable to what feminist therapy is all about. Next, we have, to those accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. And I thought this was important because a lot of times people have the attitude of like, I can't relate to this thing, whatever it is, because it hasn't personally affected me. Where I feel like feminist therapy is a lot about taking perspective taking and understanding different experiences. So I just think this was very important to include as well. And then finally, one of my favorite Instagram poets, I guess you could say, has a really awesome quote that says, "The hardest step we all must take is to blindly trust in who we are." And again, I really think that just emphasizes the importance of our experiences, our environment, our socio-cultural experience, and context to how we live and to how we function and how we are. So if you made it this far, thank you guys so much for listening. I know I went over time, but I just really wanted to make sure I was doing feminist therapy justice because this was the first time I was exposed to feminist therapy so much in depth. So some of these concepts were new to me. So constructive criticism is totally welcome, and I'm totally open to kind of having discussions about what these concepts mean. They might mean something different to you. But on that note, I'm just going to leave you guys off with this really awesome quote that I found. It says, "It took me quite a long time to develop a voice, and now that I have it, I'm not going to be silent." So, again, very powerful quote to end us off on a positive note. Thank you guys so much for listening. Emily out.